Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wynn. Welcome to the Roker Report podcast in association with the Sunderland Community Soup Kitchen. We're after a pretty solid Easter weekend where we collected 4 out of the 6 points on offer. We're still biting our nails on where we'll end up with just 3 games remaining of the regulation season. And next up, we have Cambridge Utd at the Stadium of Light. So to talk all things Cambridge, among other things I hope, we have a giant of sports broadcasting in this country. With a career that spanned over 30 years after beginning at BBC Radio Cambridgeshire, he went on to broadcast on Radio 4, 5 Live, Sky and Talk Sport. And he is, of course, a big Cambridge United fan. So we're privileged to welcome Mark Saggers. Hello, Mark.
Chris, it's really good to be here. There's a little bit more about me than just Cambridge United with football, and it actually is Sunderland, and we'll no doubt come to that.
I was amazed when you mentioned it, but thank you so much for joining us. I mean, welcome to the Roker Report podcast. I mean, from my point of view, I mentioned before we got going, it's great to have you on because you've been the soundtrack to so many hours of my car journeys over the years. So how are you keeping?
I'm keeping very well indeed, actually. I finished my contract with Talk Sport after the Euros. I've got a new exciting venture coming up very shortly with Talk TV. And it's just given me a little time, really, to take a breath. 40 years, really, at it as far as broadcasting is concerned, and within sport has been an extraordinary lifetime. And just to have the best seat in the house every week has been a privilege. But it's not just those moments, it's who you meet. My philosophy on broadcasting in the end is more about the interviews that I've done and listening to those really involved. I love the games. I love all sport. Cricket was another big favourite of mine, but football has been there right from the start. Thanks to my father, who's no longer with us, sadly, but was a PE teacher and a scout for West Ham United, and discovered Matt Holland, amongst others, and Mervyn Day, and my grandfather, who was a massive football fan and married a girl from Sunderland. Which I know will have surprised you. So my first game for Cambridge United was in 1965. And in those days, it was Southern League football. And Bill Cassidy was the centre forward, King Cassidy. And I used to go with my father to that. And I tell you, it was at the ground it's at now. And we used to be able, as little kids, to actually sit behind the goal on the wall and change ends at half-time. And it went on from there. My first game at Roker Park, though, was only a year later, 30 days after England won, about 30 days after England won the World Cup in '66. In the First Division, Sunderland beat Blackpool by 4-0. And I'll never forget Roker Park because it was the first time that I'd ever been to a real football ground. Cambridge United will forgive me that. The walk up, we parked just off down in Seaburn and did the Roker Park walk, and then you could hear the roar, mainly from the Fulwell end, to be fair, as opposed to the Roker end. But we were sitting in a pretty decent seat because my great uncle was a man called Brian Truett, who founded a betting company in Sunderland called Gus Carter. And on the back of your old double-decker buses, your older listeners will know this, was shop at Bins and get on the bus with Gus. And Brian and his sons and family, all part of our family where my grandfather had married into the other family, was quite amazing. And we were allowed in those days to go and watch Sunderland train. So we had a summer holiday up in Sunderland. I always used to know I was close there because I could see Penshire Monument. And we used to
still do that.
Do you remember that? Oh, we're still there, of course, now. And we used to have a lovely time. And then we used to go to watch them train. And in those days, it would have been Len Ashurst, Charlie Hurley. A very young Colin Suggett was very much part of the team around that time, as far as I can remember. My father always used to talk about Len Shackleton from the distant past. And then, of course, on to the big guys, the Porterfields, the Jim Montgomerys and the Billy Hughes and everyone else who went on to beat Leeds in 73. So Sunderland was always that. And I went Cambridge United way and my brother went Sunderland way. But I've seen Sunderland on numerous occasions, particularly away games, because we lived further south and if there was a live game to go to, I was always going to go. So I have a real connection with Sunderland in many ways. And what was absolutely lovely for me was that last year, before England played in what was going to be my final covering of England as the presenter of all of their matches in the major competitions, they had 2 games up at the Riverside at Middlesbrough. And my wife said, "Oh, go and spend a week up in Sunderland and retrace your grandfather's steps and what he did there and what you know." And I just had a fantastic time. And when that was going. And I can't believe we're together in League One these days. But hopefully for Sunderland, we're solidified in mid-table. But hopefully for Sunderland, 3 games though in the next 8 days. Oof, how difficult's that going to be?
It's
so
huge,
there we are.
it's
That was
huge.
the start, really. That was the start of it. I was inspired by the massive roar, the Roker roar, and I was at home when it came to Cambridge United in the Southern League. But I was there right from the start when they went into the league in 1970 and the first game against Lincoln City, and on it went. And I've never given up on them.
That's incredible. That people might think we got you on because we knew that, but no, didn't know that connection at all. But I was just going to say there, when you were talking about going just after that World Cup, I mean, you mentioned the Roker end. The Roker end was probably a bit bigger than the Fulwell end.
It was
back then, but when you went, the roof for the Fulwell end was brand new because we built that for that World Cup. And also, we would have just taken out the temporary seating because actually for the World Cup, the Fulwell end had, I think they put wooden seats in so people could sit down in the Fulwell end. So I'm sure it was back to normal by the time the game against Blackpool.
I think I'm right in saying I remember my father said, "You'll hear it," as we got out of the car. And then he said, "And don't forget that one of the greatest World Cup games ever was when the great Eusebio played, of course, for Portugal in that game against Korea."
Yeah.
You know, I was just so excited about the whole thing. It was just great, really. And I've always been a fan. That's me. I'm like you, Chris. I'm a fan, and I always used to listen to the great Peter Jones and Brian Butler, and eventually I got to work with them, which was just quite extraordinary.
When you mentioned Cambridge actually got into the league in 1970, it actually surprised me a little bit. But we'll get back into that a little bit because you mentioned that you ended up working with these heroes. It all began kind of at BBC Radio Cambridgeshire, like we mentioned up top. But I mean, at that point, did working in the local radio station, covering your old team, did that feel like the dream job at the time?
It was amazing. I thought I wanted to be a cricketer professionally. Never quite made it. And I touched on it, but wasn't quite good enough. Played a lot of minor county cricket. Played up at Jesmond in a final. In those days, of course, Durham were a minor county. Played against them many times. Yeah. But never made it. Went to sell insurance for the chairman of Cambridgeshire Cricket. And he said, "You're only coming here so I can give you time off to play for us." And I did. But I knew I eventually needed a proper job. And Radio Cambridgeshire had only just started. And I thought, I know an awful lot about the sport around here. And I just knocked on the door. And without this man, who sadly is no longer with us, the great late Julian Dunn, who'd come down from BBC Radio Stoke to Radio Cambridgeshire, I would never have got into this business. And he said, "Come in and help me on a Saturday afternoon. I know you've worked around here, and I know that you know your sport, and let's get that way." So, in fact, I covered Cambridge United reasonably early on. In those days, we used to travel on the bus. And John Docherty was the manager in those days. And one of those ridiculous stories. So he always said to me, "Mark, you can only cover these games away because you're on the bus with us. But I really want you to keep very quiet. I don't want you really to say too much. Certainly anything that you hear or see on here, I don't expect it to go out anywhere. If it does, you won't ever be able to come again." And at one point during that sort of early period, I sat with a young David Moyes, who was centre half. And he wanted to sit next to me because at that time he'd already decided that he no longer really wanted to continue playing football eventually. he wanted to be a manager. And he used to pick my brains, thinking I knew an awful lot more about the broadcasting side of things than I actually did. But he talked about his philosophies for the game and his thinking and what he did, even in those days. And he and I got up a friendship that I never lost. And I would say this to anybody who's in whatever business they're ever doing, never forget those early days and listen, because David Moyes, having trusted me then, granted me the first ever radio interview with a very young and inexperienced talker, Wayne Rooney, when he was at Everton. So,
wow.
But that went back to we were mates, and it went on from there with many. And of course, it was very different, even in those early days, that used to go to training as a reporter and watch. The manager knew you personally, of course, whether it was local radio, which I was on, or even whether it was national television. They knew you. Used to go along. And the great thing in those days used to be able to speak to managers, whether it was John Docherty at Cambridge, and eventually it came on to a guy called Chris Turner when it all changed for me, was that they'd say to you, go easy on so-and-so, I'm picking him this weekend, but his wife's heavily pregnant and she's not feeling very well. So if he has a stinker or I take him off, there will be a reason behind it. And I think we've lost that these days. But this was my introduction to it. And so I, for nearly 2 years, just helped out, did a bit of that and a bit of this. And then I got an offer, never went to university or anything like that. And I got an offer to go for an interview for a non-graduate trainee course at BBC Sport and Outside Broadcasts, as it was in those days, in London. This was 1985. And I got it. I couldn't believe it. There's three of us who got the jobs. A guy called Graham Reid Davis, who became the number 2 in the whole department. Ian Brown, who was a good football commentator and still around. And myself. And, for everybody, some of these names won't resonate for you because they were a bit before your time, Chris. But the first Friday I walked in for this 18-month non-graduate contract as a producer. 3H was the building at Broadcasting House. And on Friday, everybody turned up. And I opened the door and walked in. And on my right was Peter Jones. On my left was Brian Butler. There was Des Lynam. There was John Motson. There was Ian Robertson from rugby. There was Tony Adamson, who was best known for tennis and golf. And there was Cliff Morgan. Then there was others like all sorts of other guys who became famous names. And I'm thinking, I'm just walking through basically a gallery of the greats of radio. So in the way that you listened to me, I listened to these guys. And I spent 18 months then, and I walked into the boss's office and he said, we're going to make you do some cricket. You're not broadcasting because you're here as a producer, but we know that you played cricket and the Aussies are over for the 85 Ashes series. Peter Baxter needs an assistant. Brian Johnson needs somebody to get his beef sandwiches when you get to Lord's. You're covering the Texaco Trophy and all the Test series. Wow. And that's how it started. Brilliant. And then I went away and back to local radio. Came back to Radio Cambridgeshire because I wanted to broadcast more than I did be a producer. And there was never going to be a place for me at that stage. I needed to go away and cut my teeth a lot more. So I went back and I did the breakfast show at Radio Cambridgeshire. Changed my life literally completely. When I got back there, Chris Turner was the manager of Cambridge United, not the ex-Sunderland goalkeeper who everybody thinks he was, but he was a centre-half, and a brilliant centre-half. He'd actually played in 77 over in the States, and he'd been player of one of the seasons when there was all of the bests and everybody else at that time were all there. Great player. But he'd come back, and he'd come from Southend to Cambridge United, and he didn't live too far from Cambridge. He was the manager. And I knew eventually I wanted to get back into network broadcasting. And I got to know him a little bit. And then I just rang him up one day and I said, Chris, it's the Mark from the radio station. Could I just come along to a training session after the breakfast show and watch how you coach and how you train? And he said, yeah, come along. I wasn't married at the time. I used to finish at 9. It was show and go, even in those days. So as long as I got back for 5:30 the next morning, I didn't need to do anything else. So I went to the Abbey Stadium and they used to train there and use one of the university grounds for their training. And he sat me down and he said, right, he said, nothing leaves here. You don't go in the dressing room unless invited by the players. I don't go into the dressing room unless invited by the players. But while you're here, you can put these football boots on, put a tracksuit on, and you can come and do some training with us, even if it's only putting out some cones and fetching the balls that they kick everywhere. And Malcolm Webster, who was an Arsenal goalkeeper and went on to work very successfully as a coach with Ipswich Town as well, was his number 2. And it started from there. And I used to do that breakfast show, and then I used to go in the afternoons with Chris to keep him company in the car to combination games. He introduced me to all the managers that were there, from Brian Clough to whoever. And we used to play a game. He would never tell me who we were going to watch, but he wanted me to see if I thought there was anybody in these games that he was interested in and why he'd be interested in him. And this is where I first learned about professional footballers looking at the game so differently to us. In that day and age, in the 4th division, he was looking for legs. He was looking for box to box with the big engine, as they used to say, as much as with the skillful player. And we came very close to signing Daly and Atkinson. But it didn't happen. But Chris continued and had something about him. Hard man, great spotter of talent, though. Lovely guy, and became a very close friend. And Malcolm moved on, and John Beck came as a player, and Gary Johnson eventually came, Lee's dad, as the youth team coach. And I'm still doing the breakfast show at Radio Cambridgeshire. But I'd been made in the meantime, and I think I was the first ever player liaison officer at a football club. I think I must have been in the early 80s, really, or whatever, and towards the 90s, because no, so when Liam Daish joined us from Portsmouth, he'd had a bit of a struggle, an early career in the game, and he'd been thought of as a naughty boy, but he wasn't at all. But I met him at the station, and I told him where to live in Cambridge, which pubs to drink in, which ones not to drink in, where to go, and everything like that. And I did this with quite a few of the players, and got to know them all very well. And by this stage, I was a wicketkeeper, really, and I was now training as the goalkeeper that they used if they needed any extra training, if Keith Brannigan didn't want it. So they used to just smash balls at me after training, basically. But I went every day for 3 years, and I played a couple of reserve team games for them against Leyton Orient. Only let one in on that occasion, and few others. But more importantly than that, that was my basis for learning what to say, what not to say, and why professional footballers are the way they are, why they don't want to go back and play in the afternoon, why their concerns are so much more than ours of their form, whether they're in the team, whether they're not, and this whole development and the kids coming through. And this story I'm going to tell you now, for me, really illustrates more than anything the fine line between success and failure. So we used to come back after training and sit in this little manager's office, and Turns was in the bath. Gary Johnson and John Beck used to chat over training every day and what they were going to do at the weekend. And we're coming towards the end of this particular season, and Dion Dublin had come on a free from Norwich City. And everybody liked Dion. They all liked him. Got a great spring. But he came as a centre-half on a free transfer. And towards the end of the season, Chris said, I really like Dion, John and Gary, but I've already had a word with him. He's not what we need to get out of the 4th division. And so I've told him I haven't completely made my mind up yet, but I might be letting him go. Chris was very forthright with that. And then Becky said, what did he say? And he said, he'll probably go back into the music business or something like that. He's not sure that he'll further his career in football. And Gary Johnson said, hang on a minute, Chris. He's got a fantastic spring. He might not be that hard. He's a lovely bloke. You know how fit an athlete he is, and a really good man. Let's give him more chance up front than at centre half. And they put him up front, and they kept him. And then many years later, I went back. I was now working in network back with the BBC. John Beck called me back to the Abbey Stadium, and said, Mark, I've got together all of the goals that Dion Dublin has scored for Cambridge United. We're going broke if we don't do something quickly. I want you to put together with me this particular video and we'll send it. Tells you how long ago it was, video. We'll send it to every Premier League manager. And Fergie bit off the back of that. Dion went for $1 million. The rest was history. And he's now back. I'm absolutely delighted to say Dion Dublin as a director at Cambridge United. He joined as a director again this year. But what a fine line, Chris, between absolute failure and absolute success, having gone on to play so well for all those other great clubs he played for and becoming an England international too.
Yeah, I mean, wow. I mean, talk about a dream job. I mean, I was just thinking you were covering them, but you were kind of in behind the scenes at Cambridge. I mean, but just listening to your background there and how you started off almost speaking to the managers on a daily basis. We spoke to Bill Bradshaw a while back, and he was talking about, you know, the modern day journalist. He said he would be kind of pulling his hair out because you try to talk to players now, you try to talk to managers now. There's professional teams that the clubs have got behind the scenes where they manage what's said or how long you've got with them. I mean, looking back, you almost must be so glad that you were in that era, and you must kind of feel sorry a little bit for the people who are trying to get that information.
Oh, it's completely different. And I'll come along and illustrate that a little later. But one of those great things for that was, I mean, I was used as a bit of a sticking pins into cushion as well. I mean, I used to travel now on this stage because, of course, I was free of doing anything but the breakfast show. So I used to travel on the coach still, away from it. And they used to throw most of my clothes out the top of the coach on the way back, or they used to try and set fire to me every now and again, and all sorts of ridiculous things that these days. But I was up for all of that, you know. I mean, that was part of it, and they really trusted me. And eventually, when we got to this great side of the Kimball twins at defence, John Vaughan, who'd played for Palace, was in goal. Phil Chappell, who's working very hard still, was not that long ago for Charlton, was a good player. Peter Butler, who had arrived and then went on to play successfully for West Ham. I think he now coaches in Singapore. Dion was up front with John Taylor, which was extraordinary. And after that was the likes of Claridge and many others. So, but it was fantastic. And Chris Turner introduced me to my wife, who was a television broadcaster from the Midlands. She was a Coventry City fan, but she was working the same patch as me. And he put us on a blind date together, and that was that. And we're still happily married. Chris no longer with us, one of the first footballers, I'm afraid, to lose it in the early 60s through the dementia of heading a football, because he was a great stalwart of a centre-half. But John Beck went from strength to strength after Chris had left Cambridge United, and so did the club.
Yeah. Well, I mean, God, you mentioned some great names there. I mean, actually, just Liam Dage, I'm pretty sure Liam Dage's career pretty much ended at Roker Park. I think he got a knee injury playing for Coventry at Roker Park, and I think that was pretty much his career over. But we'll get back on a little bit on Cambridge, because I really want to hear more about John Beck, because it fascinates me. But you did mention that early on they kind of threw you into the cricket scene and how much you love your cricket. I mean, just looking at your kind of what you've been involved in, you've been in the kind of enviable position of being the voice on Olympic Games, the Grand National. You were on duty for the race that never was in the early 90s. Cricket test matches, tennis, boxing, Premier League, World Cups. And actually, just to emphasise the point of how versatile you are, I found a good description of you from your fellow Cambridge United fan, Max Rushton. Okay. When he said he's at his absolute furious best when off-air discussing the failings of public transport, which I thought was quite a good description. But you are a chameleon in terms of, you know, how many, you know, sports you've covered over the years. I mean, did you purposely put yourself out there to cover multiple sports, or did you just get the opportunity?
I got the opportunity. I think the great thing was I eventually went back when BBC Sport had sent everybody else to the Commonwealth Games in New Zealand in 1990. And I knew then I'd got an opportunity to broadcast. So I went back to work. In those days, again, it was still Sport on 2, and it was still on Radio 2. But it was coming to the end, and we were moving to 5 Live with the start of the Premier League and everything else. But it was called, I can't remember what we were called in those days. It was BBC Radio 5 Live as opposed to just 5 Live or whatever. And anyway, I get back there, and Cliff Morgan had always been a mentor of mine, the very famous Welsh rugby union player, and just knew everybody. So I went on a 3-month contract. Spoke to Jane, my wife, and she said, just go for it, Mark. You're never going to get this opportunity again. They only ask you once. They want you as a voice now, not to produce. You never wanted to produce. Go for it. So I went for it. They offered me a full-time job after a week. And Cliff Morgan, who in those days used to do a programme called Sport on 4 on Radio 4, used to get me to write a piece about something that had happened during the week. And then to do it, anything from between 40 seconds and a minute and a half that he would then put into the programme. And I used to write the piece and what have you, and he used to screw most of them up and throw them in the bin and say, you're better than that. And he was great. And 2 very quick stories about him, if I may. He was the great man. He knew everybody. And he and I were the only 2 at that stage smokers in the department. And we had a great head of sport called Mike Lewis, who wasn't a smoker. And we get to Barcelona, get picked for the Barcelona gig. And we're in the broadcasting centre and you have your own office and everybody else is there. And Cliff Morgan sidles up to me, and he's a god at this stage anyway. And he goes, Mark, he said, I've made a little arrangement for us to go and sit outside, a small little table, 2 chairs, so that we can have a cigarette when we need one. Well, again, to cut a long story short, everyone used to pop into the BBC offices, say, from Juan Antonio Samaranch to royalty to superstars, is Cliff in? And they used to say, oh, he's probably out the back writing things up with his mate, who was me. And we started off with 2 tables and a little round table. Within a week, and this was before the games really started, we had a little bar out there and cafeteria. We had umbrellas. We had meeting. He basically brought this place together. And both he and Terry Wogan were on that trip together. And I worked with Terry Wogan. And that combination, again, taught me the little bit that I needed at that stage when I thought, you know, I was the greatest now. I was actually the boxing commentator, would you believe, at the 92 Olympics. Michael Carruth was the Irish winner of a gold medal, and I commentated on that. But I worked with Terry on he was doing all his sort of bits and pieces around everything. And I perhaps got a little bit too serious. There was a couple of Bulgarian weightlifters who failed drug tests and everything, and I wanted to do all this quite seriously. Anyway, Wogan took me out and said, Mark, I know that you want to be a serious sports reporter, and you will be. He said, but with me on this show, I want it to be a bit lighter. In fact, what I want you to do now is I want you to disappear after the bulletin tomorrow morning. I don't want to see you for days, and we'll see what happens. And I said, well, I've got to do this, my job. He said, no, I've had a word with the boss. Go and just disappear. Go and watch some other sport. Enjoy yourself. Anyway, he started this ridiculous thing, where's Saggers? And Wogan was at his absolute height there, because he was really Radio 2, but working for us. And where's Saggers was all he asked for 3 days. And anyway, eventually, on the 4th day, he said, I think I've found Saggers. He's at the boxing arena. Let's go over to him now. And I went, ha! And he cut me off and said, yeah, that's him. We'll speak to him again at another stage. And I tell you how amazing that was. A few years later, playing cricket for the Cambridge Utd All-Stars against Lord's Taverners, and Leslie Crowther came into bat, and he looked at me and he said, who are you? And I said, Mark Saggers. He said, I found you. And I said, excuse me. He said, where's Saggers? I mean, that was terrible. So I had all of that. I had Cliff Morgan, then I had all the other great broadcasters around that. And it was more relaxed in those days. And it was, so all of these things going on. And 92, the Olympics for me were incredible. But I learnt for my television days more than anything as well. I was a floor manager, working for BBC TV. And now Wogan has decided I'm talking again. I'm still at the boxing and everything. And I think it was one of the great American heavyweights, George Foreman, and the lean machine. Do you remember he had a grinning lean machine at that stage? Anyway, he was there commentating. And Dave said, after BBC TV, you can have George for the show. And I'm thinking, oh, great, this is basically one of the most famous sportsmen at that stage I'd ever interviewed. And he said, but I'll give you a little bit of a nod. He said, why don't you tell Terry Wogan that you've got George Foreman for him to speak to? I said, well, I'd quite like to do it. He said, it'll do you a lot of good. Anyway, I took that, and George Foreman spoke to Terry Wogan. And when Sky came in for me, Terry Wogan helped me sort out my contract for nothing, which was extraordinary. Yeah. So those great moments along the road. And it was because really the Grand National that never was that I got that contract. I was working, the new Five Live had started, and I did a programme called Lunchtime at Aintree. And then that was the rest of my day off. Jane, my wife, was with me, and friends from up in Liverpool. We were going to stay there. And suddenly, the race that never was, the false start and everything. And I jumped down. I was very close to the Pitmans at this stage. I'd covered a lot of stuff with them. And in those days, we just had these massive reel-to-reel tapes, and there was very little live stuff except for the big shows. And I jumped over the white fence and cleaned up there. And then at 6:00, they were going to hold a press conference that everybody was going to take. And of course, the BBC had the rights at Aintree. And Bob Shannon was now the controller of Five and said, Mark, you're going to get to ask the first question. Make it a good one. So anyway, everybody was there. And in came all the famous and all of the stewards and everybody else from Aintree. And I asked not just the first question, I asked the first six. And didn't think anything more of it. And 2 days later, I got a call from Andy Cairns, head of Sky News Sport, and said, I want you to come and work for me. And I was toying between, I wanted to be a cricket commentator at that stage, because I was the only sport I could commentate on properly. Never going to be a football commentator. The presenter, great, and asking questions, but that. So I said, I want to be a cricket commentator. And I said that to Mike Lewis as well. Mike said, there's no place for you at Test Match Special, I'm afraid, at the moment or anything. So, we'd still love you to stay. And I said, I can't. I've got to go. And so I went to Sky in those very early days, Sky News Sport, just as everything was happening. And it was the best thing I ever did, really, because I presented Sportsline and went around the world with them as Rupert Murdoch's. We were his conscience, really, at that stage. He needed to get into Parliament. He needed to get television sets working. And globally, he was on this big field, and we again then went and did some extraordinary things that you would never have done. I remember outside the hospital in Victoria at the Commonwealth Games, where it was a shot putter had failed a drugs test. One of our shot putters, Paul, can't remember his surname now, and Rob Bonnet was there from the BBC. And in those days, you only had 2 5-minute windows when the satellite went over in the space of 24 hours. So you used to have to do a 3-minute recorded package to send back, so he got 2 minutes. Anyway, Rob Bonnet's there doing, Diane Medall was another who'd been taken off the track because there were concerns about her and whether she'd been involved in drugs. He hadn't named her, he just said that she was one of the English athletes, of course, at the Commonwealth Games. And the English shot putter is also in hospital. And Kenzie had said to me, no, we'd go bigger than this, even though we did everything outside. So I said, so here I am, outside this hospital in Victoria, Diane Medall snatched from the track, in many ways having perhaps snatched victory from others because she's been accused of drug problems. And then Paul, whatever his name was now, I should know it and I apologise, but Paul is lying in a bed in the hospital behind me, frothing at the mouth, having overdosed on Alka-Seltzer, trying to flush drugs out of his system and all this sort of rubbish. And that's the way we went about it. And we had no rights to anything. So we were always on the outside. So I used to have to pull people outside, and we have to try and find something very different. And that's what we did. Absolutely what we did. I went to the release from prison of Mike Tyson in Indiana. And he'd been at the Indiana penitentiary after everything that had happened. And Sky at that stage were really working hard on the boxing with Frank Warren and Don King. Do you remember, with the electric hair?
Oh, yeah.
And Mike Tyson was obviously a big fighter of his. And this was early days of a proper satellite nowadays. So we were working with a Reuters crew in Indiana. I was sent out there to do the release from prison live, which was going to be at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was the first big live that, again, Sky News and the Sport had done. So, but of course with that, it's such a big, hungry animal. They wanted way more than just me being live at that. And then when I arrived, we drove through all this Indiana countryside with all these wonderful fields of corn and everything, and the sun was burning down on you, and then you could see all the shimmering, and suddenly, literally like something out of an American movie, the 4 watchtowers with the guards with the guns on each of them, and then we're there. Turn a corner into the drive, which is a very long, 1/4 mile drive, and there's 150 ladders, step ladders, with 150 different camera crews and 150 different American reporters at 10 past the hour, all standing up together and all doing their bit and carrying on. And we joined all of that. But we had 3 days. And Don King had said to me, I understand that you're coming out. He said, I'd like you to tell the British audience that Mike is a reformed character now, and he's been reading Dickens and Shakespeare and Pliny, and he's converted to Muslim, and he's been worshipping at a mosque. Oh, I said, that's interesting. Anyway, we needed something different from what everyone else was doing. So this was the day before the release. And I said to my producer, Terry, I said, Terry, is there a North American mosque anywhere close by? Could we find out or anything and what have you? So we did, and sure enough, 2.5 miles down the road there was. So we just drove around there with our crew, knocked on the door. The imam came to the door and said, yeah, hello, can I help you? And I said, look, we're here to cover the release from prison of Mike Tyson. And they said, oh, yeah, come in. He worships here regularly. Oh, I said, he said, actually, I understand that before he goes back to his home on the hill in Ohio somewhere, he said he's coming here to worship and give praise and thanks for being reformed. And I said, can I come in? And they said, yeah, you can. Nobody else has come at all. Nobody else has said anything. But, you can come in. So I said, okay, that would be great. Can I bring my crew in? I'm afraid you can't bring your crew in. But you can come in, and from that you can tell everybody what you want. So I go back and we do the same as everybody else. And I'm thinking, is this really going to happen? But we'll park the car the other way because the airport was the other way. Anyway, 5:30 in the morning, there are helicopters. There's 4 times as many people as there ever was before. And everybody just wants... We get the shot of him coming out, and he's wearing his skull cap and everything. And he comes out, gets put into the car, big limousine, of course, Don King looking happy and waving and everything. We nail it, as everybody else does. It wasn't a difficult thing to describe at that stage. And then as soon as the doors shut, before they've even left, I've left the crew knowing that they could follow on. But I've gone with Terry, jumped in our car, and we raced to the mosque. Now, he could have gone the other way, but on now and again, you've got to take... And I was a gambler in those days. So you've got to take your chance. So we get to the mosque, and then I'm thinking I might not even be allowed in. It might all just be baloney anyway. So get to the mosque, in I get, and they said, yeah, we're expecting him. And we have a special guest here too. I said, okay. And I said, so I will be able to come in? Yeah, sure. We're not allowing anybody else in except worshippers and you, and there won't be many here and inside, but everyone will be outside. 10 minutes later, Mike Tyson walks in with Don King and Muhammad Ali. And there are the 4 of us on the front row, kneeling inside the mosque, with Mike Tyson to his left, Muhammad Ali, and to his right, Don King, and to Don King's right, me. And as they pray, and I'll never forget this, Don King was sort of bobbing up and down alongside me. And then he looked at me to the right and he just went, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. Anyway, they finished the thanks to Allah. Off they went. But it was using the great Frank Keating, who was a brilliant journalist with The Guardian and wrote, Muhammad Ali at this stage in the early 90s was between the Great Parkinson interview and the development of Parkinson's disease. Yeah. And it was before he lit the flame in Atlanta in 96. Yeah. And so they'd all left with Don King and Mike Tyson, leaving me in the car park of the mosque with 2 security guards and Muhammad Ali. And we filmed him and did everything. He couldn't really speak even then. He was speaking much more through his eyes at this stage. Just one of those extraordinarily unbelievable moments. And in 96, when he lit that flame in Atlanta, that wasn't the greatest of games. And there was the Centennial bombing and everything else that went on there, of course. But that moment, as he shuffled as he had to onto that set, everything that you'd ever seen from the greatest athlete you'd ever seen in the ring, he was giving twice as much strength to just taking that walk forward as he did. And it was an extraordinary moment and a perfect fitting end to that whole story for me.
That's incredible to end up meeting someone like Muhammad Ali like that. But I mean, just on that subject, because I was reading the list of people you've had one-on-one interviews with, and you mentioned the Wayne Rooney one. I mean, I imagine he was quite a young player and he didn't have the presence he had further down the line. But I mean, obviously the likes of Muhammad Ali were the people who you thought they're such a legendary sportsman that I'm actually in awe a little bit, and I'm going to have to really concentrate on making sure I do the right things. And
I completely agree with you, and I think that way. But again, it was a different time. It was a different time, and it was a time that you had more time. Mm-hmm. I'll come back and talk about Terry Venables in a moment, but somebody who really illustrated all of this to me more than anything was actually at those 96 games in Atlanta when we were allowed only outsiders, Sky, with the cameras. I was allowed in, but the cameras weren't allowed in any of the venues. And we used to just hope that some of the athletes would come out after they'd done their drug tests and what have you. And I had these 2 bizarre moments around the same night, I think it was. It was, definitely. There was a girl called Michelle Smith, who was an Irish swimmer, who suddenly had won 3 gold medals in the pool, beating all the Americans who couldn't believe it. And she eventually tested positive for drugs, but at this stage, she was a gold medalist. And out she came late on, and we stood talking, and we're like 2 minutes into our interview, and there's this old fella just sort of in the background, just sort of not going away and starting to look like this and everything. We're live for this, and I'm thinking, I know him. I don't know where I know him from, but I know him anyway. I said, come on in, you're obviously interested. And he said, I wanted to come in, I wanted to do this. I really wanted to shake the hand of this girl who's been absolutely magnificent and comes from that great Irish country. And it was Jimmy Carter, the former, they don't call them former, the American president. So I then do an interview with Jimmy Carter and Michelle Smith. And then we got back on another night from the pool when I think I'd been waiting for one of the English swimmers to pee into a pot. At the end of the swimming, I think this was, and to do the drugs tests and everything. And so we're back late. And we're actually, because we weren't allowed in the broadcast centre, we're overlooking Centennial Park when the bomb went off, and we're very late. And as we get back there, hardly anyone else around, the bomb goes off. And I was working with a brilliant South African cameraman called Ian Robbie, and everybody else was rushing out of Centennial Park as we were rushing into it to get to the actual scene and do the first pictures and try to help with the whole situation there, which again was very different for me. And the unfolding story over the next 3 hours was I was back in my sort of news head at this stage, and Jeremy Thompson was our great American correspondent, but he was nowhere to be seen because this was very late at night and he'd been working on the other stuff. So I'm there to do the first live on what is now the mega story of the Atlanta Games. And we're on the roof overlooking Centennial Park. And like in all those great American movie films, there's that door on the roof when they have the cops and robbers chase. Do you remember that? They open out, they come. Yeah. Anyway, it's like 30 seconds before we're due on, and I've got all of the armed police, and everybody is there now, and we'll have it all down below. And Jeremy, dear old Jeremy, brilliant news broadcaster, bursts through this door, combing his hair like that, and saying, and holding up his phone going, "It's London. It's me they want, not you." And I said, "I'm not moving." And I didn't. I did the first one. And then for the next 3 days, he had me chasing everywhere while he stayed there. But I mean, all of these moments are just stuff you just couldn't. I mean, you couldn't make it up, but it was extraordinary. But you had to be there, and we put the hours in. I mean, we were on 18 hours. I think when I worked at Sky News, worked it out with Jen, that I was away about between 7 and 9 months for a 4 or 5 year period, just covering stories everywhere. There we are. Yeah. It was great.
I mean, you've already mentioned the organisations that you worked for, and I did up front. I mean, BBC on a national level for around kind of 20 years over 2 spells. You're at Sky for almost a decade, TalkSport for around 10 years after that. Yeah. I mean, all completely different organisations and at different stages of their development as well. I mean, did you ever feel the need to kind of tailor your approach depending on which organisation you were working for at the time, or did that not come into the equation when you were going through your preparation?
I think it did very much, but I think I'd got such a really good grounding from the broadcasters that I worked with at the BBC. Ron Jones, who was a great Welsh commentator, good footballer, good cricketer. He always said, just say what you see. No more than that, Mark. You don't need to make anything up. Say what you see. Do your homework. Don't tell everybody what you know, and ask those that everybody wants to hear from. And they sort of stayed with me. I mean, I used to do the Today programme with Brian Redhead and John Humphreys. And in those days, there was the political interview was always before my bulletin at 8:25, my second bulletin. And Thatcher would be sitting there and correcting my English on my bit of paper next to me after having just done an interview or whatever. And I remember Brian Redhead when Tony Blair, I think he was even just shadow health in those days. He after he'd done his first interview on the Today programme, and I'd been in there sitting, waiting for my go. And he walked out, and Brian Redhead just turned to John Humphreys and said, "If John Smith doesn't become the next Prime Minister of the Labour Party, he's going to be the next one after that." And just sort of extraordinary moments. But moments that now have changed so much. So when I covered Terry Venables' England, 18 months up to Euro 96, there was at all the training sessions and at the press conferences afterwards at Lilleshall, there would be one local television crew from the regional ITV station. There would be a football focus, and there was us. And that was it. Sky Sports News didn't really exist so much even at that stage. So that was it. So 3 cameras, and that made me, after asking 2 very difficult questions of Terry Venables at the first interview I ever did with him, hauling me up afterwards and saying, "I don't know why you can ask me questions like that about me." And I said, "Well, because that's my job." And he said, "Well, I want to find out more about you. I'm not happy with that sort of questions because you know that he was having a problem with Alan Sugar and everything going on at Spurs and everything at that stage that had." And I said, "Well, how are we going to sort that out?" And he said, "Well, you're going to take me out for lunch." And this was 18 months out from the Euro 96. And he said, "Whenever you're around," he said, "we'll go out for lunch." He said, "I'll choose where we go and you can pay for it." And I said, "Yeah, okay, that's fine." And he said, "Well, I'd like to go to the Ritz first off, and I've got a date in the diary and we'll go." So I go back to Sky and Andy Cairns, I said, "Terry Venables wants me to just go out for lunch with him, no interviews, anything like that, to get to know him more. But Sky, I've got to pay, I'm not paying." And he said, "Yeah, no, that's fine, we'll do it on the one-off basis." And Terry Venables just listened, as you are, very patiently to me now saying, exactly what you're asking. How had I got into it? When I used the Cambridge Utd effect, of course, that really resonated with Terry. And we had lunch every month right up to the Euros. But after the 3 or 4 of these, he told me 3 or 4 stories that I knew as a freelancer I could have gone and sold for a few bob if I wanted to. Never did though. He was testing me. And then I got invited down to Scribes, which was his club at that stage in Kensington High Street, underneath the great old shop called Barker's. And it's where they all used to go for karaoke and everything like that, and have a great time. And he became a really good friend again, as well as just manager of England. And he was great with his players. And the players then he had were extraordinary, from Gazza, of course, in midfield, to Shearer and Sheringham and David Seaman, everybody else. But he then made me start every time we went out for lunch, and it was just the two of us, and he'd say, right, I want you to write down the side now, every time we go out for lunch, that I will start Euro 96 with. And so he gave me this napkin, and he said, I'm only going to give you one clue. I have only made my mind up, if he's fit, about one player that will definitely start for me at Euro 96. And, I said, well, no, it could have been any of them, couldn't it? Shearer, Sheringham, Gazza. He said, Gary Neville at right back. And I said, oh, that's a shocker. He said, no, it's not. He said, I haven't got anybody else who can do that job in the country for me in the way that he can. He's brave, he's strong, he's got great vision. He sees things before an awful lot of other people. And if I've got somebody like that at the back, I know then my midfield can do what I want them to do, which is go further forward than defend deeper. And he said, so Gary Neville is the first, and you can write the other 10 down. And we went from there, really. And then about 4 months out from the Euros, he said, is there anything you ever want back from me, Mark? And I said, if you ever lose this job, I'd like the exclusive interview. And he said, you've got it. Now, anybody can say that, can't they? There was still the trouble, and he was obviously going to go to the courts or whatever to defend himself against Alan Sugar and everything else that had gone on at Spurs. So the FA were not happy with any of this. And they used to be at Lancaster Gates in those days. And there was a meeting with Terry about 4 months out, I think, from the Euros. And we were all outside. We were never allowed in. But Ted Buxton, who was Terry's number 2 at that stage, and a man that put out the cones, really, and looked after him. He'd actually been Terry's dad's butcher, even though he became manager of China in the end, which was quite extraordinary. But he was a good man. Anyway, he came outside and he found me. And he said, Mark, he said, there's going to be a big press conference at the Royal Lancaster Hotel at 5 o'clock. Terry is going to coach and manage the side for the Euros, but then that's it. They want him out. And they've done a deal so that he stays. He wanted a new contract. They're not going to give him one, but he'll stay till the Euros, and then he's gone. But there's going to be 3 seats at this press conference, and Graham Kelly's going to be there, and David Davis is going to be there as the press officer, but Terry's not going to be there. He's already left. He's gone back to Scribes. He said to me that if you can get away from here quietly with your camera crew, he's waiting for you down in Scribes to do the interview. So we're now driving a very short distance from Lancaster Gate to Kensington High Street. You could only get into Scribes straight off the pavement. So you can't get in unless the person from inside lets you in. So I'm on my way there. My boss rings me, Andy Cairns, and says, we're going massive, Mark, on this Royal Lancaster Hotel press conference. I'm bringing 2 further camera crews down for you. You'll host it all, ask the questions, and we'll go from there. And I said, I'm not going to be there, Andy. He said, what do you mean you're not going to be there? So I said, well, I don't want to say too much, but I'm not going to be there, but you've got to trust me. And he did trust me. Well, he said, well, what do I do? What do I do? So I said, well, you're going to get someone else quickly down to that press conference. So anyway, so I'm thinking, well, here we go. If I don't make this with Terry and he doesn't let me in, I've probably lost my job. He did let me in. I go downstairs. He's sitting there with a cigar, glass of champagne in his old fake Georgian armchair, and gives me a brilliant interview. And it's the exclusive, absolutely. He was working much later that evening for ITV, but this was the exclusive. And again, it was the days of tape. So I've done this interview very quickly, rushed with it to Millbank, which was our other studio, which was the Parliament building, and hot rolled it, as we say, at 6 o'clock. So they just played it back to the front, quickly wrote a cue for them. And they played it in the top of the 6 o'clock news. And it was the first time that both the BBC, Channel 4 and ITV had to go cap in hand to Sky News and had to put the strap up speaking exclusively on Sky News, and that cemented my relationship with Rupert Murdoch, really, at that stage. And just another extraordinary thing over. But again, as I go right back to the start of that, these things don't happen anymore because you've got 50 people surrounding a player, you've got managers who don't really want to say anything, and you've got communication directors at clubs who won't let you say anything. So those days are gone.
And it was actually the first thing I found amazing was you spent that much time with Terry Venables before those Euros, and there wasn't a dentist chair in sight.
There was lots of other things in sight. What he was so good at, though, Terry, was he knew how to press those players' buttons, and he gave them enough freedom. And again, he could, because there wasn't the mobile phone coverage. There wasn't people trying to trick them into all of this. We'd lost a lot of that by this stage, as you say, with the dentist's chair and everything that happened with all of that. But there was still enough of them being able to do things on the quiet, like other young men would always do. That, and I knew loads of things about players that I would and will never tell anybody else about till I'm gone. Really, there's no point, because it helped you for all the other big things, really.
And there was that element of trust that I think is maybe being lost now in modern day. But I mean, just quickly working at TalkSport when you joined there, because I think you joined there in 2009 from the BBC.
Yeah, I did.
And I've read one or two books that touch on some of the stories of how TalkSport functioned in the early years. I mean, by 2009, had it calmed down a little bit by the time you joined, or
not really?
No,
not really. Do you know what it was? By that stage, again, everything had changed. Computerization and everything had gone so far now, and we could do everything immediately. But with immediacy, you lose the narrative, because no sooner has somebody told you the story than somebody else thinks they've got another bit to it. And you've sort of, if you're going throughout the whole day, by the time you get to mid-afternoon and into the evening, they think, and they thought wrongly, I think, that the story had moved on so much. No, people still needed to hear that story for the first time. So that all changed at that stage incredibly. But TalkSport was basically me going back to where I started. It was pure radio again. There was nobody to help. I mean, one of the first programmes that I remember doing, Mike Parry was the programme organiser as such at this stage. And he just said, you can come in and do whatever you want on a Saturday afternoon. 6 hours it'll be. And we've only got the rugby on at the moment and one or two other things. We'll find something for you. But they didn't. I had 6 hours to fill with a producer who hadn't got a clue what he was doing either. And you opened the phones, and we did bits and pieces and what have you, and learned from that. And then TalkSport managed to get a contract of the commentary, which changed everything. But, I remember going out to the Rugby World Cup with TalkSport. Somehow we got that. Mosdy was now the programme organiser, been number 2 to Bob Shen at the BBC. We went out and covered some great matches out there, but we would do a 6-hour show from inside the stadium around a game that lasted 90 minutes, basically. And people, 40 minutes each way and a bit of injury time is what I'm talking about. And we were just ridiculously waffling on and everything. But within all of this, there were all the stories. Alan Brazil was massive in those days. Parry and Townsend used to do a brilliant mid-morning show. In the afternoon, H&J, just iconic as well. Yeah. And then we all fitted in around it. And to be fair, when first Moz said, you can do the Saturday morning show with Mickey Quinn, who was a brilliant broadcaster, and that was a real test for us, because there were no listeners at that stage on a Saturday morning, and it was big time. We did well. And Quinny was brilliant. And then from there, I got the gig in the evenings eventually, and Stan Collymore and myself on the Monday Night Club, which was, I couldn't call it the Monday Night Club. I'd invented that when I'd been at 5 Live, but they wouldn't let me take it with me. So we sort of called it something else. And I think for a year and a half, 2 years with Stan, at his best, we had over 1 million listeners, which was just extraordinary for radio at that stage, and we used to just go toe to toe, and but it was pure broadcasting right back to the very beginning, really. And I had to work, and I know that I'm going to do exactly the same when I start on Talk TV on May the 1st, that is going right back yet again, up to date completely, but back to not telling how much you know, but asking the right questions in the right way and getting the right answers.
I always find it incredible, those early stories of TalkSport with people commentating from a hotel room, kind of in the same city as the game was going on and things like that. It's incredible where they came from.
You couldn't make any of it up. I mean, I remember once in South Africa, well, the first night was sort of, I was one of the new boys. So the first night we're staying in Joburg, but the opening game is in Soweto. And we'd all got together. The security was obviously going to be a problem anyway still. And we were staying in the financial district of Johannesburg and quite away from the stadium. And we said, look, it won't matter about getting to the stadium. I said, but when we come out afterwards in the middle of Soweto, we don't want to be left around as we were on many occasions at other places we talked sport. Nothing had ever seemed quite booked and everything. It was all part of it. Liam Fisher and dear Matt Smith. Liam Fisher, who's been a very successful boss, obviously, and still there now, looking over all under Scott Taunton, all the stations at Talk now and at UK News. And he said, I can assure you, Mark, that we have sorted this all out. And there we are, 3 hours after everybody else has left the stadium in Soweto, 2 a.m. But that was that. I mean, we did at one point, I went out there for the draw, which is another extraordinary, 4 days in South Africa. And I knew that something was up because Mos D was the boss at this stage. And I met him at the airport. And it was just me and him flying out and meeting the others later who were going out for the draw. And he didn't even have a suitcase with him. And I said, well, what are you doing? He said, I've got to buy some gear when we get inside the terminal and everything. And nobody knew he was coming out there with me. So he came out. And we were there for 3 or 4 days, did a very successful job. I got an exclusive with David Beckham, which was absolutely brilliant. And then he stayed out there with Matt to do more. But he'd got himself sunburned. And because he'd had no clothes, he'd bought shoes in South Africa. And he got these massive blisters. And he literally crawled around into sort of massive meetings with FIFA and other sort of programme organisers. And he was a beetroot bread with skin peeling off him. But he said, it didn't matter. Didn't we have a great party after everything had worked so well? And that was that. But don't let that misinterpret those guys. They were brilliant broadcasters, still are. Alan Brazil at his best was extraordinary. Mike Parry and Andy Townsend was laugh-a-minute stuff. H&J still going strongly. And a different world again, which sadly you can't do anymore. Well,
I mean, just again, kind of touching on that slightly, because you came through, we mentioned that kind of Sky and Sky Sports hadn't been set up and started yet, and we talked about the differences between that communication just on a daily basis. I mean, do you think you've seen a huge evolution in kind of broadcasting? I mean, you were in the thick of it. You were working for Sky as they entered the arena. So I mean, how seeing it from a front line, you had a front row seat for it. I mean, how did you view that whole evolution of how football was covered and how sport was covered?
They changed. Rupert Murdoch and his team that brought Sky in changed the face of sports broadcasting. End of. America always had done things very well, but Rupert Murdoch's Sky changed the face of football, which was the planet's greatest games. I mean, the Americans are very much looking inwards. At that stage, still are a lot of them. But, everybody else it was just all about football. The Premier League had gone through many difficult times. We'd had Heisley in 85, we'd had Hillsborough in 89, we'd had the Bradford Fire disaster at that time too. The hooliganism problem was just dreadful. And in they came. And Sam Chisholm, who was Rupert Murdoch's main man at Sky in those days, along with Trevor East and Vic Wakelin, did the deal to change the face of football, and change it they did completely. And from that moment, really, certain men within the game also understood straight away. Sir Alex Ferguson was way ahead of the rest. He realised that this was going to be the new way forward for everything. And they just kept on at it, and the BBC and ITV at that stage just didn't know what had hit them. And, whatever anybody says about Keys and Gray, that was an iconic programme over many years, and Martin Tyler's commentary, and then the others that they used, and the different bits and pieces. And again, because it was new, they could do everything and all these features with players and everything. That's even changed for all these guys now. I mean, if you remember 3 camera crews I told you for Terry Venables at the Euros, by the time I got to my last World Cup, 3 or 4 years ago now, wasn't it? 150 cameras. How on earth are you going to ask a question about anything? And how on earth are they ever going to answer anything? They're not. And that's where it has changed completely. But everyone says that age was the golden age, but it was a great age of connection between player and reporter and broadcaster, and therefore connection, because we're only the conduit through to the fans who don't get the chance to meet. We ask the questions as fans for the fans, and at times we have to ask the hard questions. But everything is so managed now, and clubs, I understand why they're doing it, have their own teams now, and very soon I think press conferences will disappear completely as far as that's concerned, because the clubs will keep it all in-house, and when they do that, the damage limitation will be even less, which I think is a shame in a way, because I think football could grow up again in many ways and realise that without the fans, you would never have anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just again, I mean, just on the subject of industry evolution, we talked about the huge one you were involved in, but I mean, moving forward, I mean, you have featured on the Amazon Prime coverage over the years, and there's been some debate on the future broadcasting, especially the Premier League in this country. I mean, can you see more streaming organisations trying to get in on the act, or even moving to a Premier League focused Netflix style platform that I think Sam Jordan's been talking about? Do you think that type of thing might happen?
I think we're again at a stage very similar to where Sky first came in, and the reason that I think like that is because the whole complexity of selling what changes now. Everybody is after the global audience. I don't know that Sky Sports News will tell you this, or Sky Sports, but basically these days they're getting more hits off YouTube for goals than they would be even off watching one of their highlight programmes. Yeah. But if you own the rights to the games as the club yourself, and you're a Liverpool or a Manchester United or anybody else in other parts of the world, the numbers games, if you can sell a television season ticket to supporters overseas at £5 a game, and there's 400 million of them, then that's why we've got so many American owners wanting to get involved now. It's more about the finance. I think we've sold a lot of the game from that point of view, but that is going to be the way it will be. And then there will be another problem in some ways on top of this, which could actually devalue everything again, is because unregulated commentary, as we used to have on Talk in those old days, will come back, because I don't see how you can police that when in the equivalent of having Alexa in your car and you just say, Alexa, get me Sunderland against Morecambe in the final game of the season. However you can get it, and by that stage, so there will be somebody somewhere who's not regulated, probably as we did off Tube or something like that, commentating on that game. So that is going to change it, I think, a lot. But there is no doubt for me that the European League that they were putting together, I'm pleased it didn't happen, but there will be games on the eastern seaboard, there will be players travelling all over, and home games and home crowds and home occasions. I'm not so sure. Well, we're not talking 10 years now, but 20 years' time, we will be looking at a global Premier League. The Premier League now, basically, is ours, but it's only because it's hosted here right now. It's a global league. It started here. Who knows where it'll finish?
Yeah, yeah. And who knows the response from Alexa if you ask for Sunderland versus Morecambe? It'll probably tell you where to go, to be honest, if you ask it to find that.
I watched Morecambe. I went to watch Cambridge United the other week. I went and stood. I've had enough of sort of being invited, really, and sitting in directors' boxes at clubs. I've really enjoyed that, don't get me wrong. And when I was sort of focused on the job, that was part of it, and at Cambridge. But, you know, having sat behind the goal at Cambridge United and then sat in the dugout when Chris was the manager, and my job was to destabilise the linesman. And in those old days, there used to be those little concrete dugouts, and there would be Turns, John Beck, Gary Johnson, Pete Melville, who was the physio, and me. And I was next to the wall. And my job was, when the lino came up early on in the game, I used to just have to sort of pop my head out and go, "We're watching you, lads. You look a little bit overweight. We're expecting you to keep up in this game, Lino." And then I'd sort of go back in, and they'd look round, and we did all sorts of things like that. And do you remember when Becky decided about the buckets and cold water and all this sort of stuff? John Beck.
Yeah.
We were having terrible away games when he'd become manager away from home. And Friday night football in those days was away at Colchester United, or it would be away at Stockport County, or it would be away at Plymouth. And in the early days, they used to have to stop off at a hotel on the Friday afternoon, have a couple of hours, and then toast and marmalade or whatever it was, before Becky brought in pasta for the first time ever. And he rang ahead to Stockport County, and he said, I was on the bus still in those days, and he said, right, Mark, he said, when we get, I've already rung ahead to Stockport and they've got 20 buckets. And when you get off with the physio, I want you off early. I'm going to do a bit of the team talk and everything beforehand on the bus, but I want you to get in there. Roy Johnson, former Arsenal physio, was then the physio, said, fill all these buckets up with cold water. I'm going to put them all in the shower and chuck it all over them. So this is your Kimballs and your Butlers and all those sort of guys, to wake them up. 2 up after 20 minutes. What John Beck could do more than anything was, he was my tennis partner on a Sunday, and he could tell people how good they were. He never had a problem of saying, you are really good, you've had a fantastic game. He inspired you to reach a belief that you didn't really realise you could get to. He went a bit far with growing the grass in the corners, or, you know, kicking the ball out because it then meant they had 11 players on the field as opposed to the opposition taking the first throw with 10, and all the other, taking the dugout right down. He went over the top with all of that. But he was one of the new fantastic managers, really, the real new science boys. He brought in a stats man before anybody else had even thought of a stats man. He changed the diets of the players, and he got Cambridge United to the edge of the first Premier League, but in the end bottled it right at the end. But I'll never have anything said against him. And he trained a lot and coached a lot of other coaches, and he was very much involved afterwards of testing them for their badges with the Football Association. I mean, done his bits and pieces in management. But at that time with Cambridge United, if it had just held his nerve, and he needed a Chris Turner there at that stage, somebody a little older than him, just to whisper in his ear and say, you're doing great, but... And Gary Johnson then became the manager. We used to go and watch Sundays. We used to play tennis in the morning after the game on a Saturday, and then Lee Johnson and John's son Tony used to play for Newmarket under-10s, and we used to go and watch them after a roast dinner. And I followed Lee's career obviously all the way through, and Gary Johnson, I remember Gary sitting down once because he wanted to be a manager, and he again was a great coach and a thinker. And he said, it wasn't working out for him. And I remember him saying it, and just saying, I've got an opportunity to get into international management. And I said, well, you got to take that. It was with Latvia. And I said, once you've joined that brigade, if you get that job, you will get another better job back here. And that's exactly what happened. And he was a terrific manager at Bristol City. And so I think was Lee. And whether Lee got long enough at Sunderland or whatever the case, it was very difficult at that stage. I think it was a long way from home as well for Lee. I think he was a a very good manager at Bristol City and a great thinker of the game and still is. And, dear old Sunderland have had difficult times, of course, recently as well, haven't they?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, with John Beck, just quickly, I always looked at him because he had that, strangely, he had that kind of, he was advanced in his years, but at the same time, he came out of the Charlie Hughes kind of, old kind of style as well. Yeah. So he was kind of had this cross between this new age and the old style as well. It was, but like I said, the results spoke for themselves.
Yeah, he was a great thinker, and he was another 100% man. Those old managers, and interesting that Neil Warnock's retired now, and others, they were sort of really nearly completely at the end of that era. They had to do everything at those clubs. They still do. I mean, like your Carl Robinsons and at Oxford is doing so well at the moment. They're similar, but in those days, they used to have to get in the car at the end of training, go and watch other players, do it all themselves, do everything. There was hardly any scouting going on from anybody else really at that stage, at that level. They did everything. It was a 24/7 job, and they were magnificent. And there was all of those guys who managed lower division clubs and still do. I've got so much time and respect for them because it's a world away now from having, a different physio for every single player at the club. It's extraordinary.
Well, I mean, just before we get into the kind of the modern Cambridge and quickly the League One at the moment, just want to talk about your recent work because you did a series of podcasts with Bet No More UK on the issue of gambling, where you said your own experiences in speaking, with people about the journey and getting the help they required. I mean, was that series kind of important to you personally?
It was very important for me to do it, and what had happened to me, I'm in recovery still. I haven't had a bet since in my very early days at Talk Sport, actually, back in 2009. And I'd always had a bet, and my family knew I'd had a bet, but I also had plenty of time and I was away a lot, and I was a very inward gambler. I was somebody that I wasted time more than I wasted a lot of money in the end, thank goodness. But I let an awful lot of people down around me. But this was my secret. And in the end, I knew to keep my family that I had to sort myself out. And GA in London changed my life. I understood right from the very start, going to those meetings, that I could identify with people who were not judging you in any way, and you weren't judging them. And it worked for me. And so Matt Smith, who had also worked with me at Talk Radio, he had also had a problem himself, and he went to work for Bet No More eventually and asked me if I would come and do this series. And of course, within the game of football, gambling has been rife over forever, really, in many ways, and it's become very different now. I would like at this point to say that I'm not against gambling. There are many people that can gamble within themselves and have a fantastic time and what have you. But there are those of us in the same way as people who drink or people who take drugs or whatever else that, this was a real weakness of mine, and I had to stop it and never do it again. And Matt Smith was another of these who worked with, was invited in by Tony Adams and Second Child Down on the south coast there, and really helped him and everything. So he was working, and he asked me if I would like to do a series, which is ongoing at the moment with people. And we started with Peter Shilton. I've just done Chris Wood, the Hampshire cricketer, which is about to come out very shortly as well. And again, it just showed that, for me, the vulnerability of all of us. I mean, at times there was me going off to a football match at Ewood Park for a great cup game, and I'd be leaving my family 3 hours earlier so I could go and have a bet on the way. And in the end, that was something that I had to stop. And my family, I was one of the lucky ones. My family have stuck with me, and I've managed to stop that. It was even more difficult than giving up cigarettes, which I did just before the Atlanta games back in the early 90s. But those were, two addictions of mine that every day I have to think about it. But to work with Bet No More has just been incredible. And I came out, as it were, on Talk Sport, and obviously not everybody had heard me. And then it was only 2 years ago on the Sunday afternoon show, or 2 or 3 years ago, where we had the press officer from the PFA had come on to talk about the problems with gambling, which I knew were rife within gambling, and unless you're really involved and you don't understand this. And he started to ask me questions, and Ray Houghton was in the studio with me, and Danny Mills, and started to ask questions, and I just said, "Stop you right there." I said, with due respect, you don't know. You're not asking the right questions. You're not talking about the right things to me. I'm in recovery of 12 years. I know about what it is, and I know, and it is difficult and complex and everything else. But now so much more is being done. And as I said, I don't ever want to say, don't gamble to anybody who doesn't have a problem, because it's like everything else. If there are many people that can have a good time with it, but if you don't at any stage, GA, Gamblers Anonymous, are fantastic companies like Bet No More that have a great peer aid system for both gamblers, and a wonderful system as well for relatives and friends of the gamblers if they need help in part of it. And recently just launched another secure area for women in gambling as well. And Bet No More and Frankie Graham, who are in charge, have just done a fantastic job.
No, that's brilliant. Hopefully it helps people get the help that they require. But one thing you've also mentioned, which I think you mentioned might have been a bit of an exclusive, it's quite recent, but you new venture with Talk, is it Talk Radio or Talk TV, is it?
Talk Radio, the 25th of April, Monday the 25th of April, becomes Talk TV. And Piers Morgan is doing a major show in the evening, which has been well documented. Sharon Osbourne is going to be there, and Tom Newton-Dunn. They're three players who are going to be very much involved. And then around this, Talk Radio is becoming Talk TV with some of the really well-known presenters. And Talk TV will be presented from the Talk Radio studios. And I'm going to be doing a sports programme from 7 o'clock on a Sunday night through till 10 o'clock. First one on May the 1st, which I'm calling the Sunday Night Club. And you don't need a membership to join it. Everybody is a member, and I want to take everybody inside the dressing room, the boardroom, onto the pitch, off the pitch, terraces. It's about all of us who I think really wants to know where our game is going now, and some of the other big issues in sport. And I want everybody just to tell me what they think, and we can all make our mind up from that. So very much as it should be, common British values together within sport, and that's the way we're going to go.
Brilliant. Look forward to that. So you said that's May the 1st?
May the 1st, Sunday, May the 1st, 7 till 10. Brilliant. So there's some big football going on, and of course it's TV now, so we'll be able to show the goal highlights as well as other bits and pieces. And if Roy Keane or Gary Neville walk out the studio, you never know. We'll hopefully get them on. We've got great ideas, big interests, but it's not just. I mean, football, of course, is one of the key things with the World Cup coming up. But there's cricket at that stage, and then we're talking about all of those stories with a little more insight, but hearing the views of the people. And let's still not forget, this only exists throughout the whole world because of fans who put their hands in their pockets. Without them, we wouldn't have professional sport.
Absolutely. Just on that point, we'll get to where the real action is, and we'll get back to Cambridge. But I just want to talk to you about Cambridge, about this season, because there is a fixture on Saturday. But I mean, what a season really for Cambridge. I mean, coming up, possibly fight against relegation. I mean, mid-table's an achievement this season for Mark Bonner.
They've done fantastic. Mark Bonner's been absolutely brilliant. I mean, he's such a good communicator. He's got one or two really good players. He's got one or two old heads alongside him. And Wes Houlihan, for instance, what a great player he is in the dressing room. And Dunk is another at the back there. They've got a great goalkeeper at the moment. And when I went back to watch them, I haven't seen them a lot recently live, but when I went back to ironically watch them play Morecambe, which is Sunderland's last crucial game, if they can win the two beforehand, they've got us obviously, and Rotherham's the other one, isn't it, to come as well. So, but Cambridge United have got something about them this season. They've got some pace about them at times, but it's quickness of thought. They don't need to be taken out of their stride, and they've got quality at all ends of the pitch, and the likes of Harvey Nibbs and Joe Ironside and all these guys have really, really shown what they can do. And I think they've surprised themselves. I think the biggest trip, I have to say, which will always be thought of this season to the Northeast, was to turn over Newcastle United up the road in the FA Cup, which was an extraordinary performance, but one that they can put together. And I think this is a really good foundation for them. They've been yo-yoing up and down and out of the league and what have you. But now, as long as they can hold on to Mark, because I think that's important as well, that they can. The American owner has certainly sort of solidified things there a lot more. He bought the club originally because his mum was a fan at Cambridge United, season ticket holder, and still in her late 70s, and goes home and away. So there's the big connection there with that. And he's done well. He's got Graham Daniels, who used to be a player at the club, who's also chair of Christians in Sport and a great thinker of the game. And, you know, they've got a really good environmental side to the club as well as social side with the whole of the area. And at the moment, they're mid-table, but they're riding high as a football club after some pretty poor times recently, and they've secured the club again. They don't really need an awful much more than they've got. It's a lovely little club still. The ground's hardly changed except the South Stand, which is where the visitors go mostly now. The rest of it's exactly the same as it was when I first went and sat behind the goal in '65.
Yeah, I mean, just on that subject, do you think, after a solid mid-table finish this season, is it a big ask for Cambridge to kick on? I mean,
no, I don't think it is. I think it's at that level, all the levels we see, the consistency is what it is all about. So they had two wins on the bounce. They come up against Charlton and they've given a lot. He's made 7 changes. Second half, a bit naive again. They let Charlton get into the game a lot more. It was tit for tat and what have you, but they've just got to learn to be streetwise every now and again. And I think that's clubs. But, you know, the great late Chris Turner always used to say to me, that's the reason we're down there, is because we will throw in the inconsistencies at times, which get punished. And when you're a professional sportsman or woman, and they do. And I think, you know, a solid base for next season with some great youngsters coming through. I know from first hand, because I was still very close to my cricket club from Cambridge, and they're no longer in partnership with Cambridge United, but they were at one stage, and they have got a massive base now around the area of younger sportsmen and women coming through that have had good, solid backgrounds and really want to play the game well. And I think the future looks really good from that point of view. And if they can find 1 or 2 from there as well, I think they're going to be good. And you know, they understand. Still at that level, they're not making fortunes. You know, there is still the dream of possibly going higher, but there is no better way really of playing sport for a living in your 20s, even if you don't make the millions and millions of pounds that only the top few do, who spend it about 5 years after they've finished anyway.
Yeah, because I mean, just on the position Cambridge find themselves, it's a strange League One. You know, you've got ourselves, Sheffield Wednesday, Ipswich, Charlton, Portsmouth, Bolton. I mean, do you think? I mean, looking at those clubs at this level, do you think it's a sign of the times that clubs stretch themselves too far, that we see so many clubs at that level now?
Everybody chased the dream. The Premier League changed it for the better in many ways through watching it and then the money that filtered down, but it never really has. The Premier League is the king. The Championship, I think, is, for me, still one of the most exciting leagues in the world. I mean, that it's just full on start to finish, 46 games, you just go for it. And it's exciting. And Leagues 1 and 2, for me, are exactly the same. And the Conference. And there are some decent players at all those levels who I think could fit into any sort of side at that level. But what's not really being given the chance are that some of those, they won't take a chance in the Premier League anymore on certain players from lower down. I understand the loan systems. I understand the way that Chelsea cynically will loan to second division for a season, but then if they think they're any good, they'll take them away and loan them into the first division, take them away, loan them into the Championship, and then possibly give them a contract or not. Outrageous behaviour, but that's another real story. And also, poaching people and families and changing things, taking the whole family to another area, giving them an opportunity to have a different life for a while so that the son can become a footballer at a Premier League club in a way, and then if he still doesn't make it, that absolutely ruins everything as well. So all of these things are going on, but unless you're a billionaire and unless anything changes, you haven't got a sniff of Premier League football ownership or anything anymore. And lots have tried it, and lots have tried it lower down, where they think that they're self-made men. They always worked. The local self-made man was the man who was probably chairman of the football club and owned a bit of the land or done this and that and put a few bob in and what have you. But no more. And I still think it's real football, though. I mean, going back to the Abbey Stadium and just walking across the common, going and sitting down outside with a few fans beforehand, and then we go in, just walk in, stand at the back of the stand. Bloke next to me's doing what he's probably done for 40 years with telling the referee what he thinks of him all the way through the game from start to finish. The other side, it's panic as usual and everything. But it's pure, real football still, as it always was. And you don't get that when you're sitting at an Arsenal or anywhere else like that, when tourists are coming in 20 minutes into the first half and leaving 5 minutes before half-time, then coming back 10 minutes and leaving again after the next 20. I mean, it's ludicrous. And trying to take photographs in front of the press box of themselves during the game. I mean, this is ludicrous. But this is what those clubs want, and that's the way it's going to go. And there are some great footballers, and it's wonderful. But real football. And Sunderland, I think it seems like something like Sheffield United did it, didn't they? They had to experience going down, and going down far enough to understand, again, what the club is about within the community. And Sunderland have always been a good club within the community for me. That whole area has had the rawness of very many different times over the years, from the shipbuilding and the mining, and they've always had the losses. And the wins are few and far between, and they understand that. And that great documentary on the great club as well, on Sunderland, in many ways. Clubs like Sunderland, if they get it right, can be successful again. But we also let's not forget, they haven't been in that top flight on a regular basis, really, for many, many years. I mean, 73 when they won the Cup, only two sides since then, like themselves, Southampton and West Ham, won the FA Cup from outside the top league. That was different. And they've been up and down, and as these other clubs have. I think you are where you are. If you're playing 46 games a season, you are where you are. And that's where they are. And I'd love to see Sunderland get up. But to talk, if they have to go as they do, if they win their game against Cambridge United, Cambridge United got a bit about them, and I'll tell you where I think that they've struggled a little bit recently. But first, if they get to Morecambe on the last day, the likes of Cole Stockton up front, and they've got another good flying winger down the right, they'll have a lot about them. Sunderland, this isn't going to be easy, these 3 games, and 3 games in 8 days, when I know that Morecambe have only got the 2 to go, haven't they? So this is a crucial time. But I think as well in Alex Neil, you've got a man who knows what he needs to do. But Cambridge United are not going to be easy. He rested 7 in midweek against Charlton. He perhaps rested 1 or 2 too many. I don't know what he'll do. I don't know whether he'll give young Mannion another game in goal. Doesn't have to. He's got 2 great goalkeepers. Mannion, by the way, I'll say it here straight. Mannion is a young 18-year-old. He's going to go all the way. He's a real little diamond that they've got there. And they've got 1 or 2 other good boys coming through. But it's been on the experience. Steve Smith up front scored some terrific goals. They are a good side, and they'll play their football, and they'll keep their patience. They'll defend as a unit. And Sunderland have got, with that extra little edge that there will be, and a big crowd, no doubt, at the Stadium of Light, of course.
Yeah.
Fascinating. First 20 minutes going to be really important there. Really important there at the weekend. So don't rule Cambridge out, but their legs might have gone a bit. And if I was to think of anything, and Mark Bonner would kill me, if you've got a flat right-hand side was the way that Morecambe punished Cambridge throughout that game, United got themselves dragged forward, and the 2 touches and a fly. If you've got a flyer down the right, I don't know who plays right side up front for.
Well,
Sunderland.
we had Jack Clark out there for a bit against Plymouth.
That was an area that Morecambe really got into Cambridge United and had the success with the goal and could easily have got another or 2. But it's all about whether Sunderland, because there's no nerves on Cambridge United. They've got nothing to play for, but they've got everything to play for. And what will they? How many? Will it be nearly a full house? It won't be far short, I shouldn't think, will it?
I think we've been getting just over 30,000,
That's
about
fantastic,
33,000. So it might be a little bit more than that, I think.
But even in those heady days on the terraces, I looked it up today. That first ever game I went to Sunderland, Roker Park, 66. There was only 24,000 there then. There'll be more there this time around for a game in Division 1, third tier. But, I mean, in many ways, it would have been great to have been there. But I'm not going to be there this weekend. But I want Cambridge to do well. But I want Sunderland, because Cambridge can't go up, to go up. And certainly my brother now lives in New Zealand, and his boys, they're all Sunderland fans. And the family and the history that we've had means that it's a no-lose situation if it comes down to it this weekend.
That's it. You've told us now that you're 49% Sunderland, of course, and you're
51% Cambridge.
I'll take that.
Never ever buy a football club with 49% of the club. You need 51% every time.
Well, with our club at the minute, it's best not to mention percentages and owners and things like that.
But these are the things that have been happening, and it's something, because over the last few years, always the talk was that Sunderland had some really good young players to come through and youth setups, but you've got to have the bottle to give them the chance. But you can only really do that when the situation allows, and that's where it gets much more difficult the lower you go down.
Well, we had 2 academy products get England to a European final and a World Cup semi-final. So we've done something right along the years.
And two of my greatest moments ever was when I came back to cover Sunderland in I can't even remember what the game was now, but I met Jim Montgomery for the first time properly, and that was wonderful. And then there was a guy who only played about 20 games for you, who then came on and played 260 games for Cambridge United when I first started covering them, called Tom Finney. Northern Ireland international, played in the 82, I think it was, World Cup finals. And he's still around. And I just thought of him and Jim Baxter and Jim Montgomery and Len Ashurst and all the others. And it's just been an absolute delight to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And of course, when it comes to Sunderland, it's a case of the beauty is in the struggle, I think.
The hope kills you every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, I mean, let's hope it's a good game on Saturday. From a Sunderland point of view, I'm hoping that the Cambridge team are already on the beach thinking about next season. But you've got us a little bit scared, because I think you've said that they're going to be really up for this one, and I think they're probably going to have a good crowd following them.
He's been clever. He's had 1 or 2 players who've been out injured who've got back in, just who haven't had the miles in the legs this year, but have now got themselves fit in the last 2 or 3 games. I think, anything could happen, as we know, but I think the occasion, and from what I've always seen at Sunderland, when you walk out of the Stadium of Light, you know that you're in a big game, and it will be Mark Bonner only has to say, feel the way you did up the road in the 3rd round of the FA Cup, and we won't go far wrong today. And for all of the advantages of a great Sunderland crowd, it always lifts the opposition. At this level, it's always twice as difficult.
Yeah. I mean, very last point, because you're an experienced broadcaster, you've seen it all. In a nutshell, do you think Sunderland's going to do it this year? Do you think we'll get out of League One?
I think that 3 games in 8 days is tough. But I think you'll beat Cambridge United. I think the important game is midweek. And I think you should win that. And then that last 90 minutes against Morecambe, fighting themselves, of course, still possibly at that stage for another reason, which might actually benefit you. I think they're there or thereabouts, aren't they? up now. But
three,
I don't
3
see any
points in
reason why.
Fleetwood
I
game
mean,
and
eight days to reach the playoffs and are in your own hands, basically.
Yeah.
You've just got to just go for it. And I think that Sunderland can do it.
Okay.
But then I would
I'll
say
take
that because they're my second team. I'm not going to say, no, they're not going to do it. You can't.
Well,
what else do I want to say? I don't want to say anything else. I want to see Sunderland back in the Championship, because I think when they get out of League One this time, they will have that Sheffield United effect. They will understand. The fans are so knowledgeable up there about the football anyway. Newcastle United are going to a different level after Project Zebra and the Saudi Arabians. Forget about them. You can't forget about them, but forget about them. Sunderland themselves have a great opportunity to get back in that Championship and to make it 2 top sides in the North East, which is what the country needs again.
Well, that's a perfect place to leave it. And on that note, I just want to say thank you very much, Mark. It's been an absolute honour and a privilege. And
Chris, it's been great.
All the best for the new venture. And if you're ever up in Sunderland, if you're ever visiting your spiritual home, please.
I shall be back.
Give us a
Don't
shout.
worry. I shall be coming back past the pension monument. I still love it. I still think that the seafront, which I think they've really smartened up well, haven't they? Roker and Seaburn, and all round the old port area now. If that had the weather of California, you wouldn't know the difference.
Exactly. I say that regular to my kids, although I'm not sure they're believers, but I try. It's been fantastic speaking to you, Mark.
Thank you for asking me, and I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks again, Mark. Really appreciate it.
I've got an extra special reason now to look out for the results over the weekend.